In a country torn by corruption and silence, where justice often sleeps behind locked palace doors, and the poor are seen but not heard, a 7-year-old girl, homeless, barefoot, and invisible, did what no army, no advisor, no politician could do. She saved the life of the president. Her hands were dirty, but her soul was clear. Her stomach was empty, but her heart burned with something bigger than hunger. She didn't hold power, but she saw through deception with eyes the world had chosen to ignore. How did a child who sleeps beneath a wooden market table see what an entire government, protected by walls and weapons, could not? And in a world drowning in greed and betrayal, why does truth always seem to come from the lowest place? This story, though fictional in detail, is real in emotion. Because somewhere out there, there are girls like Divine, and sometimes it takes the smallest voice to shout the loudest truth. The sun had not yet fully risen over Ouagadougou, but the streets were already breathing. Thin trails of smoke curled from blackened tin stoves. The air smelled of roasted maize, damp clay, and tired hope. A rooster somewhere crowed with defiance, but no one paid attention. In the heart of the city, a child chased a dented plastic bottle, bare feet slapping on the dusty road. Vendors began setting up their stalls, lifting tired canvas and brushing off yesterday's ashes. Someone shouted the price of onions. Another woman, eyes hollow, argued over the cost of water. And walking among them was a man no one recognized. His shirt was slightly faded, his pants wrinkled like he had slept in them. A cloth bag was slung over his shoulder. Not too clean, not too worn. His shoes were ordinary, with just enough scuff to suggest he was one of them. But there was something strange about the way he walked. Not like someone in a hurry, not like someone lost. No, this man walked like he was watching. He turned down an alley near the meat market, where the stench of blood mixed with morning smoke. A butcher chopped a cow's leg with practiced rage. Children passed, covering their noses. He didn't flinch. He kept walking, past a line of old men sitting on stones, hoping someone would offer them small work. Past a mother brushing her daughter's hair with fingers instead of a comb. Past 2 boys sharing a stick of sugar cane, their teeth brown, but smiling. No one looked twice at him. No one shouted his name. No one knew he was the president of Burkina Faso. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, the most powerful man in the country. But power had never been his goal. Justice had. He had spent years fighting battles that didn't make the news. Against corruption, against the silent greed hiding in polished suits, against foreign voices whispering behind Burkina Faso's throne. But lately something had been troubling him. He had become distant, surrounded by reports, filtered through advisors, escorted by men with guns and sunglasses. Every village story reached him late, softened by political language. Every complaint came on paper, never from lips. He started to wonder, am I still leading my people, or just reading about them? So he made a decision. No guards, no press, no convoy, just him. The night before, he had crept out the back of the State House while most of the palace slept. His driver asked, "Sir, are you sure?" "I need to see the truth," he had replied. Now, as the city came alive, he blended into it and began to listen. He passed a group of teenage boys standing beside a broken radio, arguing about football. "You think the president even watches the game? He's too busy flying around." He smiled faintly. If only they knew. An old woman sat under a faded umbrella selling boiled eggs. She looked up at him, squinting. "You hungry, stranger?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "But thank you." She nodded. People don't say thank you much these days. He kept walking. Every corner he turned, every pair of eyes he met, told him something the reports never could. There were too many sad eyes, too much silence. The kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from giving up. And it was then he heard it. A voice, small, scratchy, weak, but louder than anything else that morning. "Mister, please, I'm hungry." He froze. At first he wasn't sure he'd heard right. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the narrow sidewalk, until he saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, skin coated in dust, hair tangled with neglect. Her dress was more holes than fabric. Her knees were bruised. Her eyes, wide, dry, hollow, stared up at him like he was either a ghost or a miracle. And in that moment, the president of Burkina Faso felt smaller than the dust on his own shoes. He stepped closer, and what happened next would change the fate of a nation. A single acacia stood at the edge of the market, its branches sagging like tired shoulders. Beneath that thin canopy, the little girl crouched, knees to chest, arms wrapped so tight around herself it looked as if she were trying to disappear. The world bustled barely 5 steps away, vendors tossing cassava into baskets, a cyclist weaving through goats, a teacher hurrying past with yesterday's chalk still on his sleeves. Yet no one spared her a glance. Dust clung to her skin in uneven patches. It blurred the line between flesh and earth. Her dress might once have been yellow, but now it was the color of old parchment, torn at the hem, one sleeve missing entirely. Ibrahim paused at the edge of the tree's shade. Years of protocol told him to keep moving, to observe without revealing himself. But the president inside him was suddenly no match for the man who had once been a barefoot boy in a Sahel village. He crouched until his eyes met hers. Up close, he could see her lips were cracked white, and her breathing came in short, careful sips, as if even air were something that could be taken away. "Bonjour, petite," he whispered, voice gentle enough not to startle a sparrow. The girl's shoulders flinched. She pressed harder into the trunk, as if hoping the bark would open and swallow her whole. He reached into the cloth bag and drew out the sandwich he had packed at dawn. Simple bread, a smear of ground beans, a slice of tomato saved from yesterday's dinner. Breaking it in half, he extended the larger piece. "Eat," he said. "Slowly, no one will take it." She stared, pupils huge, disbelieving. One trembling hand reached out, paused, retreated, then hunger overruled fear. Fingers, small, dirty, delicate, closed around the bread. She inhaled the smell before taking a bite, and the way her eyelids fluttered shut reminded Ibrahim of someone tasting hope for the first time. Crumbs fell to the ground. She tried to catch them with her other hand, unwilling to lose even a fragment. While she ate, he lowered himself to the root beside her. The market noise faded. For a moment, there was only the slow crunch of bread and the rustle of leaves overhead. He studied her face, high cheekbones beneath layers of grit, lashes thick with dust, a faint scar above her right eyebrow. But what caught him, what locked him in place, was her gaze when she finally looked up again. Gratitude glimmered there. Yes, and relief. But behind them, something older, almost ancient, as if she were peering through him, past the moment, into rooms he did not yet know existed. "What's your name?" as he asked. Her voice emerged raspy, shy, but unwavering. "Divine." He repeated it softly, letting the syllables settle. Divine. A name heavy with suggestion, carried by a girl who looked as though the world had forgotten her before she'd learned to spell it. Finishing the sandwich, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, then folded her hands in her lap like a student waiting for the next lesson. Ibrahim pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and placed 2 crisp 1,000-franc notes in her palm. Her eyes widened so far he feared they might overflow. "Buy water," he said, "and bread for tomorrow." Divine did not move. The money lay across her lifeline like a prophecy. Slowly she closed her fist, pressed it to her chest, and, without warning, tears welled, cutting clean tracks through the dust. "Nobody ever helps," she whispered, each word a tremor. Ibrahim's throat tightened. He wanted to say there were good people in the world, that she was not alone, but the evidence around them argued otherwise. So instead he did what felt honest. He reached out and rested a hand on her head, as a father might, fingers gentle, steady. In that touch, a silent promise passed between them, one she could feel but not yet name, and he could name but not yet fulfill. Under the acacia, the city's pulse seemed to pause, waiting. Divine lifted her face. In her eyes, the ancient light flickered again, brighter this time, as if the first ember of something vast had just caught flame. "Merci, monsieur," she said, voice stronger than before. He nodded, stood, dusted off his knees. As he turned to leave, she spoke once more, softer than a leaf falling. "I won't forget you." He believed her, and though he did not understand why, a chill ran along his spine, as if the future itself had just whispered his name through the mouth of a child. Moments later, the market swallowed him, but beneath the tree, Divine sat very still, hands still clutching the precious notes, eyes fixed on the space where the stranger had vanished. Somewhere inside her, something vast and unseen shifted, like distant thunder announcing a storm only she could hear. As Ibrahim turned to walk away, he felt the weight of the moment pressed gently against his back, like a breath he hadn't yet exhaled. The market sounds returned, clinking metal, children laughing, someone yelling about sweet oranges. But behind him, silence held. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. Divine was still sitting beneath the acacia, legs crossed now, hands folded over the precious bills as if guarding a secret no one else knew. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting shadows on her face like a broken halo. And then, just as he was about to turn for good, she lifted her eyes to him, not pleading, not hopeful, certain. "I won't forget you," she said, loud enough for only him to hear. "And I will protect you." It was said so plainly, so confidently, that Ibrahim almost chuckled. Protect me, he thought. A child, skin wrapped in dust and hunger, claiming to protect the president of a nation? The idea was absurd, and yet he didn't laugh. He gave her a faint smile instead, more puzzled than amused, then offered a respectful nod. Perhaps it was her boldness, or maybe something unspoken in her tone. Either way, he walked away, not just carrying the echo of her voice, but the lingering weight of her words, not as a child's thank you, but as something deeper, a vow. He didn't know it yet, but she had planted something, a seed. By the time he returned to the State House, the guards had begun whispering. The head of security met him at the back entrance, tense. "Sir, where have you been? You can't leave like that. What if something had happened?" Ibrahim waved him off with tired eyes. "I just needed to see." The marble floors, polished to reflect the ceilings, felt colder than usual. The walls echoed too much. He passed his advisors without acknowledging them, caught up in thoughts that didn't belong in official folders or briefings. What had she meant? "I will protect you." Elsewhere, behind those very walls, unseen to him, other words were being whispered. Not words of hope, but of betrayal. In the West Wing, a kitchen officer checked his phone too often. In the garden, a guard pretended to read while watching who entered which hallway. In a private lounge, two men in suits murmured over half-finished tea. They didn't speak loudly, but their eyes darted toward the door with every third word. "Thursday," one of them said under his breath. "The tea," the other nodded. It was all moving quietly, under marble, behind uniforms, beneath loyalty's mask. Ibrahim didn't know yet, but danger had already been invited into his house, wearing the faces of those who called him Sir. And far away, under a tree now bathed in full sunlight, Divine whispered a few words to the wind. Not a prayer, not a goodbye, just a reminder to whatever force had placed her in that city, on that street, on that morning. "I've found him." Inside the grand walls of the presidential palace, where the ceilings gleamed and every corridor echoed with polished formality, something dark was beginning to stir. It didn't come with shouting or violence. No broken windows, no alarms. It arrived in whispers, in sideways glances, in the quiet movement of men who smiled too often and stayed too late after meetings. In the palace kitchen, Paul adjusted his white apron and looked over his shoulder, making sure the other staff were distracted. The air smelled of grilled chicken and steamed millet, but his hands weren't focused on food today. Tucked deep in the back pocket of his trousers was a small, folded note, a name, a time, and two words that made his stomach turn. Black powder. His fingers trembled slightly as he chopped onions, but no one noticed. Paul had worked in the State House kitchen for 9 years. He was trusted, invisible, and now that made him dangerous. Just 2 floors above him, Captain Yarrow leaned back in a leather chair in the security wing. He was the head of the Presidential Garden Patrol, a position of quiet access, often overlooked. It was Yarrow who reviewed the surveillance angles, who approved which guards stood where during the president's evening walk. He wore his uniform like armor, but beneath it, resentment festered like rot behind a painted wall. He tapped the table with a silver pen. "It's time," he whispered to the man across from him. The man nodded. His name was Cabaret, a former minister who had once controlled a lucrative foreign import channel, until President Ibrahim had cut the deal, shut it down, and redirected the money to village infrastructure. That single decision had cost Cabaret millions and worse, humiliated him in front of foreign partners. "I've waited long enough," Cabaret said, bitterness curling in his voice. "He wants to lead with clean hands. Let's see if he can still lead with no heartbeat." They weren't alone in their anger. Over the past year, President Ibrahim's aggressive reforms had ruffled the wrong feathers. He had severed shady trade deals, expelled foreign consultants who were really brokers in disguise, and shut down backdoor funding streams that had quietly kept a dozen officials fat and silent. The poor praised him. The villages called him their hope. But inside the marble, the resentment grew like mold behind gold frames. The plan was simple, elegant even. Paul, the cook, would be in charge of the delivery. He knew the president's routine better than most. Every Thursday evening, around 6, President Ibrahim would take a solitary walk in the garden, then return to the west patio, where a tray of tea was always waiting. It was his moment of calm, a rare break from meetings, papers, diplomacy, no guards, no aides, just tea, trees, and twilight. That's where it would happen. The powder was odorless, a slow agent. It would dissolve in the hot water instantly, taking about 20 minutes to take effect. Enough time for the body to relax, for his heart rate to lower, for his breathing to become shallow. Then stop. Euro had already cleared the shift schedule. That night, the garden patrol would be unusually light. He'd be stationed himself near the cameras, where he could monitor remotely. No one would be close enough to intervene. No one would even see him fall. Cabaret would ensure the narrative stayed clean. Sudden heart failure, he had rehearsed. The president collapsed after a long day's work. There would be national mourning, of course, a funeral, flowers, but behind closed doors, the power vacuum would open, and the old hands would move in again. Foreign deals could resume. Money would flow. The balance of silence would return. They thought it was perfect. They thought no one suspected. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that someone had already seen it. Not with eyes, not through cameras, but with something deeper, something older. Far from the palace walls, under the fading shade of a dusty market tree, a little girl sat cross-legged, a half-full bucket of water sachets beside her. She rubbed her forehead as if a fever were trying to rise. Her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes fluttered, and then she saw it. A room, a hand, a packet of white, a cup of tea, and a man falling. Her lips parted, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the silence between spirit and flesh, a voice whispered, "The cup has been touched." The afternoon sun in Ouagadougou was cruel that day, sharp and gold, pressing heat into every corner of the earth. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, street vendors shouting prices, taxis honking without purpose, plastic bags chasing each other in the wind. Among the dust and motion stood a little girl with a bucket at her feet. Divine, her bare toes curled on the concrete as she called out softly, "Water, cold water, 50 francs. Her voice barely rose above the market noise. A few people glanced at her but walked on. Others didn't look at all. She had grown used to it, the invisibility, but her hands remained steady and her eyes never stopped scanning the street, like she was waiting for something, or someone. It had been 3 days since the man with kind eyes had given her food. The man she now knew was the president. He had returned once after that, bringing her a small pair of sandals and a sealed water bottle. He had called her by name, Divine, as if it meant something, and maybe it did. That afternoon, something shifted. A breeze passed over the trees near the presidential gates, colder than it should have been. Divine looked up. The crowd around her blurred. The shouting faded. Even the heat seemed to pull away. Her breathing slowed, and she felt it, like a tremor inside her chest, a quiet quake beneath her ribs. Then the vision came. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't have to. It unfolded right in front of her, layered over the real world like a second skin. She saw a room, dimly lit, with a single window. A man in a white coat. She recognized him. Paul, the kitchen officer who once gave her bread scraps when no one was looking, stood near a shelf, in his hands a small white packet. His eyes darted left, then right. He opened a jar, poured the powder, stirred. A tray appeared, a teacup, steam rising. And then, President Ibrahim, sitting alone under the garden trees, holding the cup. He took a sip, smiled faintly, leaned back, and then his body went still. The cup slipped from his hand. It rolled across the patio tiles. His eyes stared into nothing. "No," Divine whispered aloud, frozen in the middle of the street. Her bucket tipped over, sachets of water spilling across the pavement. Then the voice came, not outside, not from any direction, but deep, inside the bones of her soul. "The cup has been touched. Warn him before the sun sets." Her heart clenched. She gasped, stepping backward until she hit the tree behind her. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but urgency. Then without thinking, she ran. She left the spilled bucket behind, dashed across the busy road, dodging a honking moto, ignoring the curses of the driver. Her feet slapped against the hot asphalt. Vendors shouted after her, confused, but she didn't stop. She didn't even blink. She knew where to go. The gates of the presidential palace stood tall ahead, black and gold, guarded by two men in crisp uniform. She skidded to a halt in front of them, chest heaving, arms out. "I need to see the president," she cried. "Now!" One of the guards frowned. "You again? What are you doing here?" "Please," Divine begged, voice shaking. "Tell him Divine is here. He'll understand." The men exchanged skeptical looks. "You can't just—" "Wait," came a voice from behind them. A man in a gray shirt stepped forward. It was the president's assistant, the same one who had watched her speak with Ibrahim 2 days before. He recognized her instantly. "Let her in," he said quietly. And just like that, the gates opened. Divine ran through marble halls and golden corridors, feet bare, heart pounding with every step. A maid gasped as she passed. An officer turned to follow, but the assistant waved him off. When she reached the private office, the guards hesitated, but the president, already standing by the window, turned and saw her. "Divine?" he said, surprised. She didn't waste a second. "Sir, they're going to poison your tea tonight." The room fell silent. Her voice did not tremble. "I saw it, not with my eyes, but in my spirit. A man in your kitchen. He poured something. If you drink it, you won't live to see tomorrow." Ibrahim stared at her. The silence between them felt like the pause before thunder. And then, without a word, he picked up the phone. "Bring me the security chief and the tea jar. Now." President Ibrahim stood motionless by the window, the receiver of the old palace phone still pressed to his ear, though the call had already ended. Behind him, Divine remained by the door, her small chest rising and falling, eyes unwavering. The silence stretched, dense, fragile, as if the air itself feared being the first to move. He turned to face her fully. "You're sure about what you saw?" he asked, voice low, cautious. Divine nodded. "Yes, sir. The tea, the garden. It's tonight." She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, barefoot, dusty, but somehow more solid than anyone else he had spoken to all week. He wanted to doubt her. Every logical cell in his mind resisted the idea of a child foreseeing assassination. But logic had not been kind to this country. It had allowed corruption to wear ties. It had kept lies behind curtains. And in the past week alone, this little girl had told him truths that no advisor had dared whisper. He sighed. "Then we'll test the tea." 20 minutes later, the head of security entered the room, followed by 2 kitchen staff and a lab officer from the presidential medical wing. A small metal tin of tea powder was placed gently on the president's desk. The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut breath. No one spoke as the lab officer opened the container and scooped a small sample into a testing vial. They watched as he added the reactive solution. Seconds passed. Then, the liquid in the vial turned dark gray. Poison. The room exploded into motion. Guards barked orders into radios. The kitchen officer named Paul was summoned immediately, but he denied everything. His hands shook, eyes darting like a trapped animal. When confronted with the lab results, he collapsed into the chair. "They paid me," he muttered. "They said they'd protect my family if I did it." "Who?" the president asked. Paul's voice cracked. He named a senior member of the security team, two foreign contractors and a former minister recently dismissed for embezzlement. The web unraveled quickly. By midnight, 4 men were in custody. Arrests were made quietly, without alerting the press. The official records would say nothing. Yet. But everyone in that room knew what had nearly happened. President Ibrahim stood alone later that night in the very garden where he might have died. The cup, still untouched, sat on the tray beside him. The breeze stirred the leaves above. Somewhere in the palace, Divine had been given food, a bed, and clean clothes. But before lying down, she had said only one thing. "I'm just resting. My mission isn't finished." Back in the garden, the president looked toward the stars, thinking of her words. A child had walked through the palace gates and done what his own guards, ministers, and allies had failed to do. She had saved him, not just from death, but from blindness. And for the first time in many months, he felt the weight of the nation shift. Not because of a weapon, not because of a vote, but because of a whisper from the mouth of a child. The sun was sinking low behind the palace walls, casting long shadows across the marbled floor. In the outer corridor of the presidential wing, the quiet shuffle of feet echoed as cleaners moved from one end to the other, brooms brushing gently over gold-veined tiles. Among them was Gift, one of the longest-serving palace workers, known for her silence, her discipline, and her habit of watching everything with sharp, unreadable eyes. That evening, she moved slower than usual, as though each sweep of the broom was dragging something deeper behind it. Her face was pale, lips tight, and her eyes glistened, not with tears alone, but something more dangerous. Humiliation dressed as sorrow. Her husband, Paul, had been arrested just days before. The man she had cooked for, laughed with, planned savings beside, taken in the dead of night and locked away as an enemy of the state. Poison, treason, attempted murder. Words too sharp for her tongue to hold. And now Gift stood outside the president's office, two trembling fists pressed against each other. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't need one. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the guard. "Please, let me speak to him. Just for a moment. In the name of mercy." The guard hesitated, then knocked. Moments later, she was ushered in. Inside, President Ibrahim Traoré sat behind a wide desk, papers spread in front of him, fatigue carved into his expression. He didn't look up at first. When he did and saw who it was, his jaw tensed. "Gift." She dropped to her knees before he could speak further. Her voice broke like dry wood. "Sir, I'm not here to argue. I swear I didn't know what Paul was planning. I never knew. Never. Please, have mercy on him. He was under pressure. They threatened him. We were desperate." Ibrahim rose slowly from his chair, eyes fixed on her. "Your husband tried to take my life. That is not a mistake. That is evil." She flinched as if struck. Her tears came freely now, soaking the front of her blouse. "I've worked here for years. I have nothing. My parents are old. They rely on my wages. I beg you, sir, in the name of God." "I am not God," he said coldly. "And this is not a matter of begging. I allowed you to stay because of your parents. Nothing more. If it weren't for them, you'd be gone already." Gift looked up at him, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to form a reply but finding none. After a long, suffocating silence, she stood, bowed her head, and turned to leave. But something inside her cracked. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, the rejection burning in her chest. Replayed every word, every cold stare, every syllable that made her feel like she was smaller than dust. And then she made a decision. The next evening, she moved differently. Her broom barely touched the ground. She wore a scarf tighter than usual, lipstick she hadn't touched in years. At the end of her shift, she carried a small tray of bottled water and walked with purpose toward the president's office. The guards didn't stop her. She was staff, familiar, harmless. She entered silently, placed the tray on the table, and lingered. President Ibrahim looked up, surprised. Is there a problem? He asked, suspicious. Gift stepped forward slowly. Her voice was soft. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? He asked. For your kindness, she said, offering a small smile. Most men would have thrown me out, but you didn't. I know you're under stress, caring so much. I could help ease that burden. Her hand moved toward his desk, her eyes locking on his. Stop, he said sharply, standing upright. The warmth in the room disappeared. She froze. He walked around the desk and stood inches from her. His voice was calm, but cold as iron. Let me be clear. I am not the kind of man who falls into traps dressed as pity. What you're doing is foolish and insulting. Gift's face flushed. She tried to speak, but no sound came. You are lucky I allowed you to stay. I did it for your parents' sake. Do not mistake that for weakness, ever. Her throat tightened. Shame burned in her chest like acid. If you ever try this again, he said quietly, I'll send you to join your husband in prison. She nodded slowly, eyes wide and wet, her body trembling with suppressed rage and embarrassment. Now get out, he said. She turned and walked out, each step heavier than the last. And as the door closed behind her, she clenched her teeth so tightly they ached. Inside her chest, where sorrow once lived, a new fire began to rise. And that fire had a name: revenge. In the days that followed her humiliation, Gift walked the palace halls with the same broom in hand, the same quiet steps, the same bowed head. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. She greeted the guards with small nods. She scrubbed the same tiles. She said, yes, sir, and no, ma'am, with perfect submission. But something inside her had shifted, and it pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. Shame had birthed silence. Silence was now birthing a plan. She replayed the moment of rejection over and over. His eyes, his voice, the final command. Get out. Her cheeks still burned, but the pain had morphed into something colder. Ibrahim Traoré had humiliated her, treated her like dirt under his boots. And for what? For daring to be desperate? For offering what little power a powerless woman had left? He thought she was finished. He had no idea. She began slowly, carefully, like a gardener planting seeds in hostile soil. It started in the laundry room with Mariette, a woman who had been working in the palace for over a decade, but had recently lost her housing privileges due to a budget cut. Gift approached her casually one afternoon, wiping sweat from her forehead with the edge of her scarf. It's strange, she said softly, almost as if to herself. All this talk of reforms, yet people like us lose beds while the ministers sip imported wine. Mariette looked up, curious. Gift didn't say more. She let the words linger, and linger they did. The next day she found Abdu, a former driver who'd been reassigned to cleaning duties after the president removed half the motorcade staff to reduce spending. She passed him in the hallway, broom in hand. He's cutting costs, yes, she murmured, but only for those at the bottom. I've seen the new chairs they bought for the meeting room. Italian leather Abdu didn't respond immediately, but 3 days later he was muttering those very words to another staff member in the pantry. From there the whispers spread. Gift had found her gift, sowing doubt. She never pushed too hard, never accused directly. Instead, she asked questions, posed theories, offered knowing smiles. She began speaking about the old days, when bonuses came regularly, when no one watched the kitchen budget, when foreign contractors brought gifts and everyone ate a little better. The president talks about the people, she would say, but he forgets we are the people too. Her words didn't cause explosions. They caused erosion. Quiet, steady, persistent. She knew how to target the bitter ones, the ones who felt overlooked, demoted, unappreciated under the new regime. Not everyone joined her game, but enough did. A nod here, a smirk there, a shared silence after a risky joke. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet, but it was becoming a current beneath the calm surface, one that could pull the right man under if it gained speed. Soon she started writing down names. A notebook kept under the lining of her cleaning bucket listed everyone who had given her the look, that fleeting flash of recognition, of agreement. She didn't need to ask them for anything, not yet, but she was building something, a network of discontent in uniforms and aprons. She even began dropping lines to junior guards, the younger ones, the ones bored with routine. "Funny, isn't it?" she whispered one night as she swept near the west gate. "The president trusts everyone, but doesn't realize which direction the guns are pointed when he walks alone." The guard didn't reply, but he didn't stop her either. Gift knew she couldn't hurt the president with poison or bullets. Those methods had already failed. Her weapon was subtler, more corrosive. She would use people. She would turn the very heart of the palace into a maze of whispers, where no one could be sure who was loyal and who was just pretending. And in that confusion, she would rise. It was no longer just about her shame. It was about power, the kind he thought she would never touch again. But she had learned something in her silence. When enough cracks form in the walls, even a palace can fall inwards. Quietly, completely. And she would be there when it did. Broom in hand, smile on face, waiting. It was just past dusk when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped into his office, the weight of another long day pressing into his shoulders. Papers lay scattered across his desk. Economic reforms, school funding proposals, border patrol updates. But his eyes weren't on the documents. They were fixed on the fading light outside the window, where the city hummed in the distance, unaware of the quiet wars waged within these walls. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned, and there she was, divine. She stood in the doorway like a shadow out of memory, wearing a simple dress, now clean but still too big for her frame. Her expression was unreadable, calm, almost too calm for a child her age. He gestured for the guards to step out. "Come in," he said gently. She stepped forward without hesitation, moving across the marble like a whisper. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. She just looked at him with those same haunting eyes, the ones that had once seen death in a teacup before it ever touched his lips. "There's danger again," she said quietly. He straightened. "Another attempt?" She shook her head. "Not with poison, not with weapons." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. "This time, the danger is in the air." In the words, he blinked. "What do you mean?" Divine took a breath. "Someone close to you is lighting fires, not with matches but with doubt, whispering, turning hearts, creating cracks where there should be walls." He leaned forward slowly. "Who?" She looked down, then back up. Her voice was soft, but each word struck like stone. "She sweeps the floor, but her heart is full of fire." He didn't need a name. His jaw tightened. Gift. The memory of her attempt, first at pleading, then at seduction, rushed back. The shame in her eyes when he rejected her. The silence afterward. The way the staff had started acting lately. More careful, more hushed. It hadn't clicked before, but now it did. He rose from his chair and turned to his chief guard, who had been standing silently outside. "Find her," he said, quietly, "and bring me the list of everyone she's been speaking with over the last 2 weeks." Within an hour, the palace shifted beneath the surface. Guards moved with purpose. Eyes scanned logs and hallway rosters. And when the names began to surface, Marriott in laundry, Abdu from the garage, 2 junior guards, 1 pantry worker, the puzzle pieces locked into place. Before midnight, 6 people were in custody. No one was paraded. No public spectacle. The arrests were surgical, silent, but the infection had been stopped before it could spread. Later that night, Ibrahim stood once more in the garden, staring at the moon. Divine sat nearby on the edge of the stone bench, feet swinging just above the grass. She didn't speak until he did. "You've saved me twice now," he said. She didn't smile. She just looked ahead and replied, "It's not me. It's the spirit that sees what eyes cannot." And beside her, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like truth. The night had fallen over the presidential palace like a velvet curtain, heavy and still. Most of the staff had retired to their quarters. The lights dimmed across the corridors. But in the East Wing garden, lit only by the soft glow of lanterns, 2 figures sat beneath a neem tree. The president of Burkina Faso and a girl who had become his most unlikely guardian. President Ibrahim sat with his hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant, the weight of recent events resting like stone on his chest. Divine sat beside him, legs crossed, eyes reflecting the light with an intensity far older than her years. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, like something sacred was waiting to emerge. Finally, Ibrahim broke it, his voice quieter than usual. "I never asked why you came, why you warned me, why you stayed." Divine didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, looking at the night sky. "Because it wasn't just about you," she said softly. "It never was." He turned to her. "Then who was it about?" She looked back at him, steady, calm, certain. "Burkina Faso." Her words landed like thunder in a quiet valley. He blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. She continued, "You thought I came to save you, that my mission was to protect your life, but I was sent to protect something larger, something heavier." He narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward. "Go on." Divine's voice grew stronger, not louder. "You were going to die, not just by poison or betrayal. You were dying in another way, slowly, inside." Ibrahim stiffened. "You were forgetting," she said. "Forgetting what it felt like to walk among the people, to feel the dust on your shoes, to hear hunger without needing a report. You were surrounded by walls, cameras, titles. They made you blind." He looked down at his hands. She continued, unflinching. "This palace is too clean, too quiet. It hides the noise outside. But I hear it. Every night I hear it. The children crying themselves to sleep on concrete. The mothers boiling water with nothing to cook. The fathers disappearing into mines, hoping for coins. I was one of them. And there are millions more." He swallowed hard. "You lead them," she said, "but you do not walk with them anymore." Her words were not an accusation. They were truth. And in that truth, he felt the sting of shame, but also the opening of something he hadn't felt in months. Clarity. "I thought I was doing my best," he whispered. "You were doing what they expected," she replied, "not what the people needed." There was a long silence. Crickets sang in the distance. Somewhere inside the palace, a door clicked softly. Ibrahim finally spoke. "Then why save me, if I was so far gone?" Divine turned her face toward him. "Because buried underneath the marble, you still had a heart that remembered what it was like to be hungry, to be small, to be invisible." His breath caught. She was right. He had been that child once, chasing goats through dust, learning arithmetic under a tree, sharing one bowl of rice between 4 siblings. He hadn't forgotten, not really, but he had stopped letting it lead him. He looked at her, not just as a child, but as something else, a reminder, a mirror, a calling. "So what now?" he asked. "What do I do?" Divine's answer was simple. "You remember, you return, not with guards, not with speeches, but with your feet in their dust." And then she placed her small hand over his. "You are not just the president of a nation. You are the servant of its pain. If you forget that, the palace will become your prison, and no one will come to warn you next time." He nodded slowly, eyes misted but clear. Something inside him shifted, quietly, powerfully. This girl, this child, had not been sent to save his life. She had been sent to awaken his soul. And now at last he was listening. The morning sun had not yet burned through the veil of mist that clung to the earth when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped quietly through a side entrance of the presidential palace. He wore a plain brown shirt, cotton trousers, and old leather sandals. No military insignia, no tailored jacket, no trace of office or power. The only person with him was a young bodyguard named Issa, dressed just as simply, tasked not to protect his president, but to walk beside a man on a journey of remembrance. No convoy, no press, no one knew. The vehicle was an old pickup, dusty and dented, borrowed from the maintenance fleet. They drove through the outskirts of the capital, past rising buildings and slow-moving market roads, until the city faded into endless stretches of dry land and scattered huts. The landscape began to speak its truth, not in grand declarations, but in quiet confessions. The cracked soil that hadn't known rain in weeks. The naked feet of children walking miles with jerry cans. The small graves beside homes too poor to afford headstones. By midday, they arrived at Suru, a village almost forgotten by maps, a place with no health post, no paved roads, and a school made of rotting wood and rusted tin. Ibrahim stepped down from the truck and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of charcoal and open earth. It was the same air he had once known as a boy. At first, the villagers didn't recognize him. They saw only a stranger in simple clothes. But one old woman squinted at him as he passed and muttered under her breath, "That face. I've seen that face on television." He smiled gently and placed a hand over his chest. "Yes, Mama, but today I'm just Ibrahim." She stared, speechless. Words spread quickly, not with urgency, but with quiet awe. Children peeked from behind clay walls. Young men approached hesitantly, unsure how to greet him without protocol. He waved it away. "No titles today. Just talk to me." And they did. He sat beneath a neem tree with village elders. He listened as a teacher described how the school only had one textbook for an entire class. He knelt beside a woman boiling cassava and asked why her children looked so thin. She told him they hadn't eaten meat in 2 months. A father showed him the well, dry. "We fetch water from 5 kilometers away," he said. "My daughter doesn't go to school. She carries water." In one hut, he met a boy with a fever, lying on a mat. The mother explained the clinic was too far and the medicine too expensive. Ibrahim sat beside the boy for a long time, his fingers gently stroking the child's arm. At lunch, they shared roasted yam and millet paste. No silverware, no plates, just hands and the bond of shared hunger. A child offered him a gourd of water. He drank without hesitation. By late afternoon, he walked to the edge of the village, alone. There, behind a cluster of termite mounds, he found a small cemetery. Uneven crosses made of sticks, names carved with pocket knives into wood that would not last the next rainy season. And finally, after years of being called strong, composed, unshakable, he wept. The tears came silently, steadily. He didn't try to stop them. He let them flow for every life buried too early, every child who had gone to sleep without food, every mother who had begged for medicine and found none. In that moment, the president disappeared. What remained was a man, a son of the soil, once a hungry child himself, now face to face with the promises he had made and forgotten. Isa stood quietly nearby, unsure whether to speak, but Ibrahim held up a hand. "Let it be," he said hoarsely. "Let me feel it." And he did. All of it. When he returned to the truck, he didn't speak for a long time, but his eyes, red, swollen, and clear, looked at Isa with a new kind of fire. "Drive back," he said. "We have work to do, real work." And as the pickup turned away from the dust and pain, the land behind them whispered, not in grief, but in something like hope. The atmosphere inside the presidential palace was thick with anticipation as the ministers filed into the main cabinet chamber. It was unusual, unprecedented even, for the president to call a meeting at night without prior agenda, without formal preparation. The room filled quickly with murmurs and uncertain glances, expensive suits brushing past each other, gold pens tapping anxiously on folders, eyes shifting to the grand wooden doors where President Ibrahim would soon enter. When he did, the room fell completely silent. He walked in without his usual suit, wearing the same plain brown shirt he had worn in Suru. No tie, no smile, just a firm, weary face and eyes that had seen something too real to be ignored. He didn't sit, he didn't offer greetings. He stood at the head of the long table and placed a single folder in front of him. "This is not a discussion," he said, voice steady. "This is a decision." A pause, no one moved. He continued. "I have spent the last 48 hours walking among the people we claim to serve. I've eaten with them. I've listened to them. I've seen their children sick, barefoot, and hungry. And I realize something. We've built a government that looks nothing like the country outside these walls." A few ministers shifted in their seats. Others lowered their eyes. "So here's what's going to happen," Ibrahim said. "Effective immediately, we are cutting all government discretionary spending by 50%. No more luxury conferences, no more unnecessary travel, no more foreign fact-finding missions that do nothing but spend money on hotel rooms and five-star meals." He opened the folder, revealing a breakdown. Those funds, every franc, will be redirected into 3 things: education, health, and clean water. No exceptions, no excuses. A murmur rippled through the room. One minister opened his mouth, but the president raised a hand, before a word could form. "This isn't up for negotiation. If anyone here disagrees, you're free to resign. Tonight." The room froze again. He pressed forward. "We will begin constructing local clinics, starting with the 10 poorest provinces. We will rebuild every rural school that is currently operating without a roof or toilets. And we will provide subsidized boreholes for every village that still drinks brown water." He paused, eyes scanning the room. "These changes won't win us praise from abroad. They won't make headlines, but they will save lives. And from now on, that's the only metric that matters in this room." Silence. Then slowly a few ministers nodded. One stood up, then another. No applause, no slogans, just the sound of old power bending beneath the weight of something new. As the meeting ended and they filed out, many looked over their shoulders, toward the hallway where they had occasionally seen a little barefoot girl walking quietly, eyes watchful, presence strangely still. Divine was nowhere in sight that night, but her voice had echoed through the room. She had spoken, and now policy had answered. For a brief moment, it seemed like a new dawn had begun to rise over Burkina Faso. Word of the president's surprise visits to remote villages had spread like wildfire, though not through the official press. It came from whispers, from a teacher's excited voice in a rural classroom, from a child's wide-eyed tale in the marketplace. The people were beginning to feel, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone at the top was finally listening. But in the shadows, far from the yam fields and dust roads, others were watching, and they did not like what they saw. In air-conditioned boardrooms outside the country's borders, a new kind of unease stirred. Contracts had been canceled. Access had been revoked. Influence that once flowed easily through the veins of Burkina Faso's institutions was now meeting resistance. To these foreign consultants, former development partners, and quietly embedded power brokers, Ibrahim's reforms were not brave. They were dangerous. And so the whispers returned, but this time from abroad. It began with a series of quiet editorials in international outlets, opinion pieces laced with concern, subtle in their accusation. "Burkina Faso turning inward. A nation at risk," one headline read. Another asked, "Is President Traoré too radical for regional stability?" The language was polished, the tone measured, but the intent was clear. Undermine confidence, both abroad and at home. Within days, articles began appearing in local media, unsigned pieces citing anonymous sources, criticizing the new spending cuts, claiming clinics were being built with unverified contractors, that funds were being diverted without oversight. No evidence, no names, just doubt expertly crafted and spread through a network of media houses with quiet foreign funding. Then came the talking heads. Former ministers who had lost their seats under Ibrahim's reforms were suddenly appearing on late-night radio, carefully framed as concerned citizens. They lamented the lack of transparency, the aggressive shift in foreign relations, and the undue influence of non-governmental actors. A veiled reference to the girl no one had dared name, but everyone now whispered about. Some even called it spiritual interference in national policy, but the most coordinated attack came from within the National Assembly itself. A small block of pro-foreign MPs, many of whom had once benefited from international development deals, began pushing back against the austerity measures. In session after session, they demanded explanations, accused the president of acting unilaterally, and questioned the legality of reallocating funds without full parliamentary approval. "This is not reform," one of them shouted during a televised debate. "This is regression disguised as righteousness." The people once hopeful began to feel confused again. Rumors swirled. Was the money really reaching the villages? Was the president isolating the country? Why had international funding for key programs suddenly dried up? In markets and mosques, in schools and streets, the conversations changed tone. Hope, once fragile but rising, now trembled under the weight of uncertainty. The propaganda had worked before. It was working again. Inside the palace, President Ibrahim read each headline carefully, circling phrases in red ink. He listened to the radio broadcasts at night. He studied the faces of the MPs during every session, trying to read what wasn't being said aloud. And still, through it all, Divine remained silent. She stayed in her small room near the private wing, spending more time in prayer, fewer hours walking the halls. When he passed her room, he would sometimes hear her voice, low, steady, speaking to no one visible, not frantic, not afraid, just waiting. He hadn't called for her, not yet. Something in him said this time, the battle must be fought not by her eyes but by his own hands. But the question lingered at the edge of every cabinet meeting, every policy draft, every press release prepared by his team. Can truth survive the war of perception? And if it can't, does justice even matter? Outside the gates, the people watched and waited. Inside the palace, the shadows were back. But this time they came with smiles, signatures, and perfect grammar. The palace had changed. The air was thicker, the silences longer, the footsteps softer. The whispers in the corridors had returned, not loud, not overt, but like dust floating through sunlight, always present, always drifting, impossible to hold. But it wasn't just the palace. It was divine. She had begun to withdraw. In the first days after the reforms, she had still been seen in the hallways, sometimes speaking softly with a guard, or pausing to watch the gardeners at work. A few staff members, unsure of her exact role, but aware of her presence, greeted her with cautious smiles. Some called her La Petite Prophète behind closed doors. Others, more skeptical, called her a ghost in a child's body. But now even those brief sightings had grown rare. Divine spent most of her time in a small, unused prayer room, tucked away behind the East Wing, a place few visited, and even fewer knew she had claimed as her own. The cushions there were worn, the windows narrow, and the air faintly scented with old wax and dust. Yet it was in that quiet space that she sat for hours each day, cross-legged, motionless, hands folded or resting in her lap. Sometimes her lips moved in silent prayer. Other times, she simply stared forward, as if watching something no one else could see. When the aides came to bring her meals, she ate little. When the president checked in on her, never with formality, always gently, she met his eyes with kindness, but said few words. "I'm listening," was all she would often say. She was listening, yes, but not to the palace, not to politics. She was listening inward, downward, far beyond the voices of ministers and debates and news broadcasts. Something in her posture said she was preparing. For what? No one could say. Perhaps not even her. In the late hours of the night, she sometimes walked barefoot across the cool tiles of the courtyard, whispering to the stars. One guard claimed to have seen her standing still in the rain, arms outstretched, face lifted to the sky like she was waiting for an answer. Another swore she had called a bird down from a tree just by looking at it. No one could prove anything. No one dared question her directly, but everyone began to feel it. She carried something now, a weight not her own, an invisible burden that pressed her shoulders but never made her stumble. There was a stillness in her presence that unnerved even the most disciplined staff, as if she knew that something bigger than all of them was forming, something none of them could escape. Even the president, a man who had faced death, betrayal, and war, could not shake the sense that she was bracing herself for a final act. An unseen storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And though she said little, her silence spoke volumes. It was not the silence of fear or withdrawal. It was the silence of someone preparing to stand in the fire one last time. She was not hiding. She was waiting, because something was coming, and she could feel it breathing. It was just before dawn when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped quietly through the East Wing corridor, the hem of his simple linen tunic brushing softly against the marble. He moved without his usual escort, carrying neither files nor phone, only the weight of thoughts that had kept him awake through the night. He had faced coups, foreign pressure, and venomous lies from people he once trusted. But what unsettled him most now was the silence of the girl who once warned him with fire in her voice. He found her where he knew she would be, in the small prayer room behind the palace chapel, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of candlelight. She didn't turn to look at him as he entered. She was still, eyes half closed, hands resting lightly on her knees. He sat down beside her, leaving space between them. "I came," he said softly, "because I don't want you to leave." She remained silent. "I know you said your mission was to protect the nation, Not just me, he continued. And maybe that mission is ending. But the truth is, I'm not ready. He turned to her fully now. Not ready to walk this alone. Divine finally opened her eyes, calm and deep. You're not alone, Ibrahim. You never were. Then why does it feel like I can't hear anything real anymore? He asked, voice breaking slightly. I have advisors. I have ministers. But their words, they sound like echoes in a cave. Hollow, rehearsed. She looked at him now, not as a child, but as something far older. That's because you're listening too much to voices that speak loud, but not deep. He was quiet, absorbing her words. She continued, listen not only to your advisors, but to the silence and to the suffering, because silence speaks the truth no one dares say, and suffering never lies. Something shifted in him. She didn't give him orders. She didn't draw plans. She only gave him a direction, a compass, hidden inside humility. That very week, a new decree passed under the president's seal. All government communications would be made transparent to the public. Budgets, policies, project updates, down to the last franc. State media would be restructured, independent fact-checking teams created, and access to investigative journalism protected by law. But more than that, Ibrahim ordered the creation of a People's Voice platform, a digital and village-level feedback system where every citizen, even in the most remote village, could report, question, or challenge government actions without fear. Their voices would be compiled, reviewed weekly, and sent directly to his desk. He no longer relied solely on the filtered voices of his cabinet. He turned his ears to the people, to the silence, and to the suffering. And as he read the first handwritten notes from a small school in Fada or a market woman in Kaya, he realized Divine hadn't just saved his life. She had taught him how to truly hear. It was near midnight when the dream came. Divine lay curled in her small room near the eastern wing of the palace. The moonlight poured through the lattice window, bathing her in a pale glow. Her breathing was slow, her face peaceful, but behind closed eyes something stirred. The air shifted, the silence thickened, and then it arrived. She stood in a vast, polished chamber, one she recognized but had never stepped into. The National Assembly Room. Mahogany tables glistened beneath golden light. Flags stood proudly behind leather chairs. And there, just beneath the gleaming wood floor, something moved. She knelt, pressing her hand against the boards. They were warm, too warm. Suddenly, through a gap between the planks, she saw it. A serpent. Its body thick, scales glistening like oil. It lay coiled, unmoving, but its eyes were open, watching, not striking, not fleeing, just waiting. Then the voice came. The snake is not dead. It is watching. She gasped awake, her heart pounding. Sweat clung to her back despite the cool air. For a moment she sat still, listening to the pulse in her ears. Then without a word, she rose and stepped barefoot into the hall. Minutes later, she stood at the door of the president's private office. Ibrahim was still awake, poring over reports under dim lamplight. He looked up as she entered, concern flashing across his face. Divine? What is it? She spoke calmly, but her voice trembled slightly at the edges. I saw the assembly room in a dream. There was a snake beneath the floor. It did not strike, but it watched. The president furrowed his brow. You think there is another traitor? I don't think, she whispered. I know. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing. Who? Divine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window and stared into the dark courtyard. This one is harder, she murmured. He does not speak often. He does not fight. He simply sits and waits. He nods when others argue. He blends into silence. That's why no one sees him. Ibrahim clenched his jaw. His thoughts flew to his advisory council. 12 men and women, each carefully vetted. Some vocal, some cautious. But now he realized there was one whose presence was so neutral, so consistent, that it had become invisible. His heart is still with those you've cast out, Divine continued. He waits for you to slip. Then he will rise. The president walked to his desk and placed a hand on the council dossier. His fingers lingered over the name of the man she did not speak aloud. He had trusted him for years, or rather, had never thought not to. Divine turned back to him, her eyes steady. The fire you thought was gone is still smoldering beneath your floor. If you don't look under it, it will one day burn the house. Ibrahim didn't speak. He didn't have to. He knew what needed to be done. And this time, he would act before the snake could strike. By morning, President Ibrahim Traoré had a plan. He summoned only his most trusted intelligence officer and whispered a strategy that required no arrests, no accusations, just patience and eyes wide open. They would plant a single piece of false information, nothing harmful, but specific enough to be traceable. A fabricated decision about relocating foreign investment funds to a controversial partner. Within 48 hours, it appeared, word for word, in an online article published by a foreign-backed blog known for veiled propaganda. No one outside the president's council had been briefed on that information, and among the council, only one person had been present but had said nothing. His name was Alain Sory, a man who had once stood at Ibrahim's side during the first reforms, who had eaten in his home, prayed in his prayer room. A quiet, intelligent man, loyal in speech but invisible in action, and now revealed. The president did not call for guards. He invited Alain to tea. They sat in the private library, two men who had once dreamed together of a new Burkina Faso. The air was heavy, but calm. "I trusted you like a brother," Ibrahim said, gently but without disguise. "So why did you sell my silence to those who want to own our voice?" Alain stared at his cup, hand steady. "Because I still believe you're right. But I also believe you're moving too fast, too harshly. You're cutting roots before new ones have grown. You're angering those with power who can bury this country in silence." "You mean the ones who used to pull our strings?" Ibrahim asked. "I mean the ones who still can," Alain replied softly. "And you're ignoring them." Ibrahim nodded slowly, eyes sharp. "I'd rather die honest than rule quietly in their favor." "No," Alain said. "You'd rather be remembered. And that's dangerous." A long pause. Then the president stood. "We all face the choice one day, Alain. Protect the system that fed you, or defend the people it forgot. I've made mine." Alain rose too. "So have I." No threats, no shouting, just a friendship ending without blood, but with a wound far deeper, betrayal of shared dreams. Alain left the palace that evening. No arrest, no press, just exile, quiet, permanent. The president returned to his desk and whispered, not to himself, but to the silence, "The snake has been seen." The next morning, Alain Sory's name was quietly removed from the council list. No announcement, no explanation. He had simply disappeared from the seat he once filled every week. The other advisors noticed, of course, but no one asked. In the palace, silence often meant truth had already spoken its piece. When Divine heard the news, she didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She only whispered, more to the wind than to anyone present, "Justice that is silent still speaks the loudest." President Ibrahim heard those words later that night as he sat across from her in the courtyard. She was sitting on the edge of the stone fountain, bare feet dangling just above the water. He joined her in silence for a moment. Then he said, "It won't be the last. There are always more snakes." She nodded. "But now you know how to feel them moving, even when they pretend to sleep." He looked out across the darkened courtyard, then back at her. "What would you do if you were me?" Divine tilted her head slightly. "I'd make sure the palace stops waiting for the snake to bite and starts watching for the rustle in the grass." The very next day, the president signed a quiet executive order, one that wouldn't make headlines but would change everything behind closed doors. He established a new department, buried deep within the presidential administration, the Office of Ethical Oversight. Independent, anonymous, directly reporting only to him. A system not of spies, but of watchers, of listeners. Because now he understood. Corruption doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And he was ready to hear it all. It was still dark when President Ibrahim heard a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find Divine standing silently, her small figure framed by the dim morning light. Her face was calm, resolute. "My mission is done," she said simply. The president froze. "What do you mean?" "There is still more to fix, more to fight. Stay, Divine, please." She smiled softly. You don't need me now. You've learned to see, to listen. That's all I came for. But what if danger returns, he asked, voice cracking. She looked him in the eyes and whispered, then another will rise. It's not about me. It never was. Before he could speak again, she gently stepped back, turned, and walked away. He stood at the door, heart heavy, watching her fade into the corridor, like smoke in morning air. When guards came later that morning, she was gone. They searched everywhere, her prayer room, the kitchens, the courtyard, even the security cameras. Nothing. No footprints. No farewell. As if the girl who had once saved a nation had simply never existed. Some staff cried. Others stood in silent awe. One officer whispered, she was never just a child. But what remained wasn't her body or her name. It was her words. Not everyone who smiles with you is your friend. Listen not just to advisors, but to the silence. Burkina Faso is the mission. She left behind no goodbye, only a legacy that moved deeper than politics, into the conscience of a country. Months passed. President Ibrahim began a new term, stronger, wiser, no longer just a man in office, but a servant of the people. Budgets were open. Corruption was chased out. Schools reopened in dusty villages. Clean water flowed through forgotten towns. The people believed again. And yet in the quiet moments between meetings, when the wind rustled through the palace courtyard or the moonlight painted the floors, he would pause, look up, and whisper, thank you for sending her. She had walked away. But Burkina Faso had finally begun to walk forward. This story reminds us that leadership is less about wielding power and more about staying close to pain. A child who owned nothing except empathy became the mirror that forced a president and an entire nation to confront its own reflection. Divine's warnings, though wrapped in mystery, echo a simple truth. Societies crumble not when enemies attack, but when conscience falls asleep. Ibrahim's real victory was not surviving poison or betrayal. It was rediscovering the courage to listen, first to a hungry girl, then to millions of silent citizens. In a world drowning in noise, the most radical act is still to pause and hear the unheard. Real change begins where humility meets action and where compassion translates into policy. Your turn. What silent voice in your community or your own life might be waiting for you to listen? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.